The wind that swept across the Northumbrian coast in the year of our Lord 995 carried with it the salt of the North Sea and the smoke of burning villages, and on that wind rode the fate of a boy who would become legend, though the legend would distort his life beyond all recognition. Uhtred, son of Waltheof, entered the world not in the chaos of a Danish raid as romantic tales would have it, but in the stone-walled security of Bamburgh, that fortress perched on its black rock like an eagle's nest, where the gulls screamed their ancient songs and the waves beat themselves to foam against cliffs that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms older than memory. His father Waltheof held the earldom of Northumbria not through conquest, but through the complex web of allegiance and blood that bound the northern English to both their Saxon heritage and the reality of Danish power that had reshaped Britain like a blacksmith hammering iron into new and deadly forms. The Northumbria into which Uhtred was born existed as a shadow of its former glory, when kings like Edwin and Oswald had ruled from the Humber to the Forth, and their power had made Rome itself take notice, when the monasteries of Lindisfarne and Jarrow had produced scholars whose Latin prose outshone anything written south of the Alps, when the Northumbrian Church had sent missionaries to convert the heathen Germans in their dark forests. But the Vikings had come in 793, their dragon-prowed ships emerging from the morning mist to fall upon Lindisfarne like wolves upon sheep, and what they had begun in plunder they had completed in conquest. The great heathen army had swept through Northumbria in 867, had captured York, had killed King Ella in ways that the chronicles described with horror and that popular imagination embellished into the gruesome ritual of the blood eagle, though whether this was truly practiced or merely a poetic metaphor mistranslated from Old Norse remains a question that scholars still debate in their careful, measured tones that can never quite capture the terror of those who lived through it. By the time of Uhtred's birth, Northumbria had passed through fire and emerged transformed, its Danish conquerors settled into farmers and traders, their Thor and Odin giving way gradually to Christ, their Thing assemblies and their concepts of personal honour blending with English traditions to create something neither purely Saxon nor purely Scandinavian but uniquely northern. The city the English called Æthelred and the Danes called Jorvik had become a place where Norse and English lived side by side, where the street names reflected both tongues, where merchants grew wealthy on trade with Dublin and the Baltic, and where silversmiths worked walrus ivory brought from Greenland alongside English gold. The earldom that Waltheof held existed at the sufferance of the southern English kings, who claimed overlordship of all Britain, but it existed also as a nearly independent realm, bound more by self-interest than by genuine submission to Winchester, or whatever southern town currently housed the court. Waltheof understood power in the way that northern lords had to understand it, as something fluid and contingent, requiring constant attention and the balancing of forces that could never be permanently reconciled. His own position rested on his marriage connections, his military prowess, his careful distribution of lands to warriors who would fight for him, and his equally careful maintenance of relationships with the great Scandinavian families who still looked to their cousins across the North Sea, and who remembered when York had been the capital of a Viking kingdom that had sent its merchants as far as Byzantium. The boy Uhtred grew up in this world of careful calculations and sudden violence, where a lord's hall might ring with laughter and the music of the harp one night and run red with blood the next, where every man who could afford it went armed, and where the difference between life and death often came down to whether you had friends at your back when the axes came out. The education of a northern lord's son in the late 10th century bore little resemblance to the courtly refinement that would characterise aristocratic upbringing in later centuries. Uhtred learned to ride before he could write, learned to hold a sword before he learned to hold a pen, though he did learn both, for the northern English nobility had not entirely abandoned the scholarly traditions that had once made their land famous. He would have studied Latin with a priest, would have heard the stories of Roland and Arthur, would have memorised psalms and learned the prayers that marked the hours of the day, but his real education came in the training yard and the hunting field, where he learned to judge distance and timing, to read the terrain, to understand how men moved in groups and how panic could spread through a shield wall like fire through dry grass. The hunts were not sport but preparation, for a boar could kill a man as surely as any Scots raider, and the skills needed to bring down a stag in the forest were the same skills needed to run down a fleeing enemy. But violence in Northumbria came not primarily from external enemies, but from the endemic instability of a frontier society, where royal authority existed more in theory than in practice, and where disputes over land, over inheritance, over insults real or imagined could escalate into blood feuds that lasted generations. Waltheof's position as Earl made him not just a warrior but a judge, arbiter of disputes that might otherwise be settled with swords, and young Uhtred would have watched as his father heard cases, made judgments, tried to maintain peace among men who valued their honour more than their lives and who would kill or die over a perceived slight. The concept of honour that dominated northern society bore little resemblance to the chivalric codes that would develop later. This was a more primal thing, rooted in reputation, and the absolute necessity of revenging injuries lest one be seen as weak and therefore vulnerable. A man who failed to respond to an insult invited further insults, invited challenges to his property and his person, and in a world where law enforcement meant what you could enforce yourself, weakness was a death sentence. The Norse influence on this honour culture cannot be overstated, for the Scandinavian settlers had brought with them concepts of personal worth and family obligation that meshed well with existing Germanic traditions to create a society where the individual's standing depended entirely on his willingness and ability to defend it. The sagas that were being composed in Iceland during this same period, though not yet written down, reflected these values in their tales of men who chose death over dishonour, who pursued vengeance across oceans and years, who valued reputation above life itself. These were not Christian values, not in any meaningful sense, though the northern lords were Christian and supported churches and monasteries. Rather, they represented a more ancient worldview that Christianity had baptized but not fundamentally changed, and this tension between Christian teaching and warrior values would define Uhtred's world as much as any political boundary. The political situation in Britain at the end of the 10th century presented a puzzle of overlapping claims and contested authorities that made every noble family's position precarious and every alliance temporary. To the south, the Kingdom of England was consolidating under a line of capable kings who had pushed back the Danish settlers, had reconquered the Danelaw, had created something approaching a unified realm, but this unification existed more on parchment than on the ground, and the farther north one travelled, the more theoretical it became. King Æthelred, who would later earn the unfortunate nickname the Unready, though this was actually a pun on his name, Æthelred Unred, meaning noble counsel, no counsel, ruled from the south with authority that diminished with every mile. His relationship with the northern nobility was one of mutual suspicion. They feared his attempts to impose southern control, while he feared their independence and their continued ties to Scandinavian powers. Waltheof navigated these treacherous political waters with the skill of a man who understood that his survival depended on never fully committing to any side, while convincing all sides that he was committed to them. He paid tribute to Æthelred when demanded, attended court when summoned, provided troops when required, but he maintained his own power base in Northumbria, kept his own counsel, and made his own decisions about matters that the southern king would have preferred to control. This balancing act was made more complicated by the presence of Scottish power to the north, for the kings of Alba were expanding southward, pressing claims to lands that had once belonged to the ancient kingdom of Strathclyde, and they viewed Northumbrian independence as an opportunity to be exploited. The border between English and Scottish territory was not a line on a map but a zone of contested villages and uncertain loyalties where families might shift their allegiance based on who seemed stronger at any given moment. Into this complex political environment came news that would reshape everything: the renewal of Viking raids on England. These were not the settling expeditions of earlier generations, but pure military campaigns, professional armies led by Scandinavian kings and jarls who sought wealth and power in the rich lands of England, and who found in Æthelred's realm a kingdom grown soft with prosperity and ill-prepared for the kind of warfare at which the Northmen excelled. The raids began in 991, small at first, probing attacks on coastal settlements, but they grew in scale and ambition as the Vikings realised that English defences were weak, and that the unified kingdom created by Alfred the Great and his successors was not as unified as it appeared on the surface. By the time Uhtred reached his teenage years, the raids had become invasions, with Viking fleets numbering in the hundreds of ships carrying thousands of warriors who could strike anywhere along the coast and then vanish before English forces could respond. Æthelred's response to this threat demonstrated both the resources at his disposal and his fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the problem he faced. Rather than building a navy or fortifying the coasts or creating a mobile army capable of a rapid response, he attempted to buy off the raiders with tribute, with vast payments of silver collected through increasingly burdensome taxes that came to be known as the Danegeld. The first payment, in 991, amounted to £10,000 of silver, an enormous sum that demonstrated English wealth but also English vulnerability. The Vikings took the silver and returned the following year, for they had learned the lesson that teachers try to prevent students from learning, that threats produce rewards. Each payment was larger than the last, and each payment bought less time, and the English kingdom bled silver while its people grew to despise a king who seemed incapable of defending them. For the northern nobility, this crisis presented both danger and opportunity. The danger was obvious. Viking armies were operating in England again, and while they initially focused on the south, there was no guarantee they would stay there, particularly when many of these raiders had connections to the Scandinavian families who had settled in Northumbria generations earlier, and who might view their distant cousins with more sympathy than they viewed the southern English king. The opportunity was equally clear. Æthelred's weakness and his need for support meant that northern lords could extract concessions, could increase their independence, could strengthen their own positions while claiming to be loyal defenders of the realm. Waltheof understood this dynamic and played it expertly, offering support to the crown while ensuring that support was never so complete as to make him dependent on royal favour. But the game of political manoeuvring that Waltheof played so well was interrupted by the most personal of tragedies, the kind that reminds us that for all the talk of kingdoms and armies and political strategy, history is ultimately made by individual human beings who bleed and die and grieve like anyone else. Waltheof died in 995, not in battle as a warrior might hope, but of illness, his body betraying him where enemies had not, and his death threw Northumbrian politics into chaos. Uhtred was young, perhaps 14 or 15 years old enough to fight, but not old enough to command the automatic respect that his father's age and experience had garnered, and the earldom that should have passed to him was suddenly contested by men who saw in the succession crisis an opportunity to advance their own interests. The exact circumstances of what happened next are obscured by the passage of time and by the fact that multiple sources tell different versions of the story, each shaped by their own biases and agendas, but we can reconstruct the general outline. Æthelred, seeing an opportunity to install someone more compliant in Northumbria, appointed his own candidate to the earldom, a man whose name the sources disagree on, but who was clearly seen as a southerner, an outsider, someone who would owe his position entirely to the king, and who could therefore be relied upon to follow royal directives. This appointment violated northern expectations about inheritance and about the right of the local nobility to have a say in who ruled them, and it generated immediate resistance. Uhtred found himself at the centre of this resistance, not because he actively sought the role, but because he was Waltheof's son, because he represented continuity and legitimate succession in a society that valued bloodlines, and because those who opposed the southern appointment needed a figurehead around whom to rally. The confrontation that followed demonstrated the brutality that lay beneath the surface of aristocratic politics, the way that disputes among the nobility were settled not in courts or through negotiation, but through violence that differed from common banditry only in the social status of the participants. Uhtred and his supporters killed the king's appointee, ambushing him and his retinue in circumstances that the sources describe vaguely, but that must have involved careful planning and probably inside information about his movements. This was not a battle, but an assassination, the killing of a man who had every right to expect safe passage through lands that were theoretically at peace, and it was also an act of open rebellion against royal authority. That Uhtred committed this act while still a teenager tells us something about either his exceptional boldness or his terrible situation. When your choice is between killing or being dispossessed and probably killed yourself, age becomes irrelevant. Having killed the king's man, Uhtred faced the problem that faces all rebels, what to do next. He could not undo the killing, could not apologise or negotiate his way back into royal favour, for he had crossed a line that made compromise impossible. Æthelred could not ignore the murder of his appointee without appearing weak, without inviting every other noble in England to settle their grievances through violence. But Uhtred could not submit without expecting severe punishment, probably execution. The standoff that resulted was resolved not through decisive victory by either side, but through the intervention of the same political realities that had created the conflict in the first place. Æthelred needed the north, needed its warriors and its resources as the Viking threat grew more serious, and he could not afford to alienate the entire Northumbrian nobility by pursuing vengeance too vigorously. Uhtred, for his part, needed some form of legitimacy, some way to transform himself from rebel to recognised authority, and only the king could provide that. The compromise they reached reflected the practical nature of medieval politics, where principles were negotiable but power was not. Uhtred would be recognised as Earl of Northumbria, would hold the position his father had held, but he would demonstrate his loyalty through service, through providing troops for the king's wars, through attending court and making the public demonstrations of submission that medieval kingship required. He would also, and this was crucial, marry a woman chosen to bind him to southern interests, to create through marriage the loyalty that could not be ensured through force. The woman was Ecgfrida, daughter of Æthelred, and connected to the powerful northern family that had its own reasons for wanting peace between Uhtred and the crown. The marriage was political in the way that all aristocratic marriages were political, a transaction involving land and power and alliance, and whether the individuals involved had any feelings for each other was irrelevant to its purpose. This marriage, contracted when Uhtred was perhaps 16 years old, marked his transition from rebellious youth to established lord, and it set the pattern for his long career as a political survivor in an age when most men who achieved power lost it violently and quickly. He had learned early the lessons that would keep him alive through decades of conflict, that loyalty was conditional, that alliances shifted, that today's enemy might be tomorrow's essential partner, that survival required flexibility and the willingness to do whatever circumstances demanded. These were not noble lessons in any conventional sense, but they were the lessons that the late 10th and early 11th centuries taught to those who would listen, and killed those who would not. The early years of Uhtred's rule as Earl coincided with the escalating crisis of Viking attacks that would eventually destroy Æthelred's kingdom and bring England under Danish rule. The raids that had begun as nuisances grew into full-scale invasions as Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, decided that rather than extracting tribute from England, he would conquer it outright and add it to his growing Scandinavian empire. Sweyn was a different kind of enemy than the opportunistic raiders who had plagued English coasts. He was a king with resources and organisation, capable of maintaining armies in the field for years, of coordinating complex campaigns, of turning military success into permanent political control. His invasion fleet appeared in English waters in the early years of the 11th century not to raid but to conquer, and the English kingdom that had seemed so powerful and prosperous revealed itself to be hollow, its unity superficial, its defences inadequate, its king incapable of inspiring the kind of determined resistance that might have turned the tide. Uhtred's position during this crisis was complicated by geography and by politics. Northumbria's distance from the initial Danish attacks gave him some breathing room, but it also meant that the south was devastated while the north remained relatively untouched, creating resentment and suspicion about northern loyalty. When Æthelred demanded troops and money to resist the Danes, Uhtred provided them, but not with the enthusiasm or the scale that the king wanted. An accusation circulated that the northern earl was hedging his bets, keeping his forces strong while the south weakened, perhaps even contemplating an alliance with Sweyn. These accusations were probably unfair but not entirely unfounded, for Uhtred's primary obligation was to his own survival and to Northumbria's security, and if that meant being less than fully committed to a southern king who had shown himself incapable of effective resistance, then that was simply the reality of the situation. The Danish conquest unfolded with terrible inevitability through the first decade of the 11th century, as Sweyn's forces captured one English stronghold after another, as English armies were defeated or melted away without fighting, as the great nobles of the realm calculated their odds, and decided that Sweden offered better prospects than Æthelred. The English king's response to this disintegration of his realm demonstrated a paranoia that was perhaps justified, but that accelerated the collapse he feared. In the year 1002, Æthelred ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England on St. Brice's Day, November the 13th, a genocide that was imperfectly executed but that succeeded in killing thousands of men, women and children whose only crime was their ancestry. The massacre accomplished nothing militarily, but provided Sweyn with excellent propaganda and ensured that reconciliation between English and Danes was impossible. This was now a war of extermination, and the Danes were winning it. Northumbria, with its mixed English and Scandinavian population, presented particular challenges during this period of ethnic violence. Uhtred ruled over both groups and depended on both for his military strength, and the attempt to implement Æthelred's massacre order in the north would have torn his earldom apart. The sources do not tell us clearly what Uhtred did on St. Brice's Day, whether he attempted to carry out the order or quietly ignored it, but Northumbria did not descend into the ethnic bloodletting that characterised some southern regions, which suggests that Uhtred chose practical governance over ideological purity. This choice, if choice it was, demonstrated the kind of political wisdom that would characterise his career. The understanding that symbolic gestures matter less than actual power, and that preserving your military strength is more important than pleasing a distant king who cannot protect you. As Sweyn's conquest progressed, Uhtred faced the decision that every English noble had to face, when to abandon Æthelred and submit to the Danish king. The decision was made easier by the fact that Æthelred fled to Normandy in 1013, effectively abandoning his kingdom, and by the fact that Sweden was offering favourable terms to English nobles who submitted peacefully. Uhtred went to Sweden and made his submission, and in doing so he secured his position as Earl of Northumbria under a new master. This was not treachery in any meaningful sense, for medieval loyalty ran both ways, and a king who fled his kingdom had broken his side of the feudal bargain. Uhtred owed Æthelred nothing, and owed his own people the security that could only come from making peace with whoever held actual power. But Sweyn died suddenly in February of 1014, and his death threw English politics into chaos again, for he had not completed the conquest, had not fully established his authority, had not made arrangements for succession that all parties would accept. His son Cnut claimed the Danish throne and the conquest of England that his father had begun, but the English nobles who had submitted to Sweyn had submitted to a victorious king, not to his untested son, and they saw in Sweyn's death an opportunity to renegotiate the terms. Æthelred returned from Normandy with promises of better governance, with commitments to address the grievances that had made his rule so unpopular, and many English nobles, Uhtred among them, returned to their allegiance to the English king. This was not sentimentality, but calculation. Cnut was young, and his hold on England was tenuous, while Æthelred, for all his faults, was a known quantity with an established claim in English support. The renewed war between Cnut and Æthelred was brutal and destructive, with armies marching back and forth across England, burning and looting, treating the civilian population as resources to be exploited rather than people to be protected. Uhtred provided troops for Æthelred's campaigns, but he also had to defend Northumbria against Scottish attacks. For Malcolm the Cun of Scotland saw the English chaos as an opportunity to push southward and had invaded Northumbria, while Uhtred was occupied with the Danish war. The multi-front conflict that resulted demonstrated both Uhtred's military capabilities and the impossible situation he faced. He could not be everywhere at once, could not defend against the Scots while fighting the Danes while maintaining order in his own territory, and something had to give. What gave was Uhtred's relationship with Æthelred's son Edmund, who would later be called Ironside for his fierce resistance to the Danes. Edmund and Uhtred campaigned together against the Danes with some success, forging in the process a personal bond that transcended the political calculations that governed most aristocratic relationships. They were close in age, both warriors, both dealing with impossible situations, and they seemed to have genuinely respected each other in a way that was rare among medieval nobles. But their personal relationship could not overcome the strategic realities they faced. The Danes were better organised, better led, and increasingly supported by English nobles, who concluded that continued resistance would only bring more destruction. Æthelred died in April of 1016, and his death removed the last symbolic obstacle to Danish rule. Edmund Ironside tried to continue the resistance, and Uhtred initially supported him, but the situation was hopeless. Cnut controlled most of southern England, had vast resources, had military superiority, and was offering peace terms that were not unreasonable. Edmund and Cnut fought several indecisive battles, but neither could achieve the decisive victory that would settle the question, and both sides were exhausted. The agreement they reached in late 1016 divided England between them, with Edmund ruling Wessex and Cnut ruling the north, including Northumbria, but Edmund died weeks later under suspicious circumstances, leaving Cnut as undisputed king of all England. For Uhtred, Cnut's victory presented a familiar problem. He had fought against the Danish king and now needed to make peace with him. He travelled to meet Cnut to make his submission, to negotiate the terms under which he would hold Northumbria under Danish overlordship. The meeting took place not in some grand hall, but at a place called Wighill in Yorkshire, and Uhtred came with a small retinue, as was customary for such diplomatic encounters, trusting in the conventions that governed such meetings, and in the practical reality that Cnut needed the northern nobility to maintain order in the north. This trust was misplaced. Cnut had Uhtred murdered, assassinated in violation of every principle of safe conduct and honourable dealing, killed by a Northumbrian Thien named Thurbrand the Hold, who had his own reasons for wanting Uhtred dead, and who found in Cnut a king willing to use assassination as a political tool. The murder of Uhtred achieved Cnut's immediate political objective of removing a potentially dangerous northern lord who had fought against him and who might resist Danish rule, but it also initiated a blood feud that would ravage Northumbria for generations. Uhtred's son Æthelred dedicated himself to avenging his father's death, eventually tracking down and killing Thurbrand. But Thurbrand's son killed Æthelred, and the cycle of revenge continued through multiple generations, destabilising the north and demonstrating that some political problems cannot be solved through assassination, that violence generates more violence, that the old codes of honour and vengeance that governed northern society could not simply be wished away by kings who wanted stability. The historical Uhtred died at perhaps 36 years old, having ruled Northumbria for approximately 21 years through one of the most turbulent periods in English history. He had survived rebellions, invasions, civil wars, and multiple changes of regime, had fought Scots and Danes and fellow Englishmen, had made and broken alliances with a flexibility that kept him in power long after most men in his position would have died. He was remembered in the north as a powerful lord and capable warrior, though the details of his life were quickly obscured by time and by the political changes that followed Cnut's conquest. His descendants continued to play important roles in northern politics, but they never regained the prominence that Uhtred had achieved, and within a few generations the family had faded from the historical record. But if the historical Uhtred disappeared into obscurity, the legendary Uhtred grew in the telling, as historical figures often do when they capture some essential truth about their era, even if the specific details are wrong. The Northern English needed heroes in the generations after the Norman conquest, needed to remember a time when English lords had ruled the north, when resistance to foreign invaders was possible, when individual courage and cunning could change the course of events. Uhtred became one of those heroes, his story embellished and altered, merged with other traditions and other heroes, until what emerged was a figure who bore only a passing resemblance to the historical Earl, but who embodied something true about the Northern English experience. The Durham tradition preserved and elaborated Uhtred's story, for Durham had been part of his earldom, and the Durham monks had their own reasons for maintaining the memory of a powerful northern lord who had supported their monastery and defended their lands. They recorded his deeds in their chronicles, but they also shaped his story to serve their institutional interests, emphasising his piety and his generosity to the church while downplaying his violence and his political opportunism. The Uhtred who emerges from these sources is already more legend than history, a Christian warrior who fought against pagan Danes, a defender of the church, a man of honour in an age of treachery, and while these characterizations contain elements of truth, they also obscure the more complex and morally ambiguous reality of the historical figure. The Scotland dimension of Uhtred's career deserves more attention than it usually receives, for his conflicts with Scottish kings shaped northern England as much as his dealings with Danish invaders. The Battle of Carham, fought in 1018, 2 years after Uhtred's death but sometimes attributed to him in later sources, saw a Scottish army defeat the Northumbrians and establish Scottish control over the Tweed Valley, permanently altering the border between England and Scotland. Whether Uhtred fought at Carham or whether he died before the battle, his resistance to Scottish expansion was a defining feature of his earldom, and his failure to permanently secure the northern border had lasting consequences. The lands between the Tweed and the Forth, which had been Northumbrian in earlier centuries, passed into Scottish control, and the border that emerged from this period remained, with minor adjustments, the border between England and Scotland to this day. This Scottish conflict reflected deeper currents in northern British politics, currents that ran back to the collapse of Roman Britain and the creation of the early medieval kingdoms. Northumbria and the Scottish kingdoms were both successor states to the Roman province, both heirs to Celtic and Germanic traditions, both shaped by conversion to Christianity and by integration into the wider European world, and their conflict was not simply about territory, but about which power would dominate the north, which culture would define the region, which king would extract tribute and military service from the people who lived in the contested borderlands. Uhtred's wars against the Scots were thus part of a much longer story, one that began before he was born and continued long after his death, a story about identity and power and the construction of nations from the fragments of empire. The economic dimensions of Uhtred's power also deserve consideration, for medieval politics was ultimately about resources, about who controlled the land and the people and the trade that generated wealth. Northumbria in the late 10th and early 11th centuries was not the economic powerhouse it had been in the 7th and 8th centuries, when its monasteries had been centres of learning and its trading networks had stretched across the North Sea, but it was still wealthy by the standards of the time. York was a major trading city, its markets filled with goods from Scandinavia and the Baltic, its craftsmen producing high-quality metalwork and textiles, its mint-striking coins that circulated throughout northern Europe. The Earl of Northumbria controlled this wealth, or at least extracted tribute from those who generated it, and Uhtred's ability to maintain armies and build alliances depended on his ability to tax and extract resources without provoking rebellion. The relationship between lords and peasants in this period was exploitative in ways that modern people, even those familiar with general medieval history, often fail to appreciate. The peasants who worked the land had no rights in any meaningful sense, no recourse against lords who demanded excessive labour or tribute, no protection against the violence that accompanied every political dispute. When armies marched across Northumbria, whether English or Danish or Scottish, they lived off the land, taking food and livestock and whatever else they needed, and the peasants who protested were killed or enslaved. When Uhtred fought his wars, he fought them with other people's sons, with men conscripted from villages that could not refuse and could expect no compensation if those men died. The glory and honour that chronicle writers attributed to lords like Uhtred was built on a foundation of peasant suffering that the chronicles rarely acknowledged and never condemned. The religious landscape of Northumbria added another layer of complexity to Uhtred's world, for the north had been Christian for centuries but retained cultural practices and attitudes that church reformers in the south considered backward or heretical. The Northumbrian church was less centralised than the southern church, more influenced by Irish traditions that emphasised monasticism and personal piety over hierarchical organisation, more tolerant of practices like clerical marriage that Rome condemned. Uhtred would have been Christian in the sense that he attended church and supported monasteries and observed the major feasts, but his Christianity coexisted with warrior values that were fundamentally pagan, with a code of honour that valued vengeance over forgiveness and that saw violence as a legitimate response to insult. The churchmen who recorded his deeds struggled with this contradiction, trying to present him as a good Christian while acknowledging his violence, and the result is a portrait that reveals more about the tensions within medieval Christianity than about Uhtred himself. The question of what Uhtred believed, what he thought about when he was alone, what hopes and fears motivated him beyond the obvious desires for power and survival, cannot be answered from the sources we have. Medieval chronicles rarely recorded internal thoughts or motivations, focusing instead on actions and their consequences, and even when they attributed motives to their subjects, those attributions reflected what the chronicler thought should motivate someone rather than any real insight into psychology. We know what Uhtred did, or at least what the sources say he did, but we can only guess at why he did it, at whether he saw himself as a defender of English liberty, or simply as a man trying to hold power in a chaotic world, at whether he had any larger vision or simply responded to events as they unfolded. What we can say with confidence is that Uhtred's world was one of constant uncertainty, where the political landscape could shift dramatically in weeks or months, where alliances formed and dissolved based on immediate advantage, where today's essential partner might be tomorrow's deadly enemy. This uncertainty shaped how people thought about loyalty and honour, making those values more flexible and situational than later, more stable eras would permit. A lord like Uhtred had to balance competing obligations to the king who theoretically ruled over him, to the warriors who served him and expected reward and protection in return, to the church that claimed spiritual authority over all Christians, to his own family and their interests, to the broader Northumbrian community that looked to him for leadership. When these obligations conflicted, as they constantly did, there was no rulebook to consult, no authority to appeal to, only personal judgment and the knowledge that wrong choices meant death. The military tactics of the period reflected the limited resources available and the personal nature of warfare. Battles were relatively rare because they were risky and expensive. A lord who lost his warriors in battle lost his ability to defend his lands and extract tribute, and even victorious battles could be Pyrrhic if casualties were high. Instead, warfare consisted largely of raids and sieges, of sudden attacks on enemy territory followed by rapid withdrawal, of surrounding fortifications and waiting for the defenders to starve, of political manoeuvring to isolate enemies and build coalitions. When battles did occur, they were brutal, close-quarters affairs fought with swords and axes and spears, where individual courage mattered but where the cohesion of the shield wall mattered more, where a few minutes of chaotic violence could determine the outcome and where the losing side often suffered catastrophic casualties as organised retreat dissolved into rout and slaughter. Uhtred would have fought in several such battles during his career. Though the sources record few details, we know he campaigned against the Scots, against the Danes, probably against rival English lords, and each campaign would have involved marching armies across difficult terrain, maintaining supply lines, dealing with disease and desertion, making rapid decisions based on incomplete information. The image of the medieval warrior as a simple fighter is misleading. Successful commanders needed logistical skills, needed to understand how to move large groups of men and horses, how to find or carry sufficient food, how to maintain discipline among warriors who were often barely controlled anyway. Uhtred's survival through 20 years of warfare suggests he possessed these skills, that he was more than just a brave fighter, that he understood the complex realities of medieval military command. The fortifications that dominated the northern landscape also played crucial roles in Uhtred's career, for control of strongholds meant control of territory in ways that field armies could not provide. Bamburgh, his primary seat, was nearly impregnable, its location on the coastal rock making assault almost impossible and siege difficult. Holding Bamburgh meant that even if Uhtred lost field battles, even if enemies ravaged his lands, he had a secure base from which to rebuild and resist. Other fortifications, less dramatically situated but strategically important, controlled river crossings and roads, anchored local administration, served as rallying points for military forces. The Earl of Northumbria needed to control these fortifications, needed to garrison them with loyal warriors, needed to ensure they were provisioned and maintained, and the resources required for this were substantial. The social structure that supported Uhtred's power was essentially a military hierarchy, with free warriors holding land in exchange for military service, and peasants working that land to support the warriors. This structure was not unique to Northumbria or to England, but characterised early medieval society throughout Western Europe, though with significant local variations. In Northumbria, Scandinavian influence had created a class of independent farmers who were freer than peasants in southern England, who had rights in local assemblies, who could bear arms and had some voice in community decisions. These men formed the backbone of Northumbrian military strength, but they also limited the Earl's authority, for they could not simply be commanded but had to be persuaded, had to be shown that following the Earl served their interests. Uhtred's political skill lay partly in his ability to maintain the loyalty of these independent-minded warriors, to convince them that his leadership offered the best chance for security and prosperity. The role of women in this society was subordinate but not negligible, for women could inherit property under certain circumstances, could wield influence through their male relatives, could occasionally rule directly if no male heir existed. Uhtred's wife Æthelred appears in the sources only as a name, her personality and opinions lost to history, but her family connections were important to Uhtred's political position, and she must have played some role in maintaining those connections. Later medieval sources, sometimes attributed to early medieval noblewomen, a romantic agency they almost certainly did not possess, creating stories of love and intrigue that reflected later sensibilities rather than historical reality, and we must resist the temptation to impose such narratives on Æthelred or other women of the period. What we can say is that noblewomen were political actors, whose marriages and family relationships mattered, even if they rarely controlled their own fates. The Norse heritage of many Northumbrians influenced their language and culture in ways that persisted long after the political independence of the Viking kingdoms had ended. Old Norse words entered the English language, particularly in the north, where place names ending in by and thorp marked Scandinavian settlement, where people used Norse terms for everyday objects and activities, where legal concepts derived from Scandinavian tradition. This linguistic and cultural mixing created a distinctive Northern English identity that was neither purely Saxon nor purely Norse, but something new, and this identity shaped how Northumbrians understood themselves and their place in the broader English kingdom. Uhtred embodied this mixed heritage, his name Norse in origin, but his position rooted in both English and Scandinavian traditions, his career demonstrating that the categories of English and Danish were less clear-cut than chronicles written in the south suggested. The transformation of England under Cnut following Uhtred's death showed how conquest could reshape a kingdom without destroying its fundamental structures. Cnut ruled England not as a foreign occupier but as an English king who happened to be Danish, maintaining English laws and customs, governing through English institutions relying on English advisors. His assassination of Uhtred was an act of political expediency, not ethnic hatred, and the northern earls who succeeded Uhtred served Cnut loyally because he offered stability and respected their local power. This pattern of conquest followed by assimilation had characterised English history for centuries, and would continue through the Norman conquest 50 years later. England was a prize wealthy enough that conquerors wanted to preserve it, not destroy it, and the English institutions were flexible enough to accommodate new masters. The memory of Uhtred persisted in Northumbrian tradition, partly because he represented a last moment of Northumbrian autonomy before the region became firmly subordinated to southern control. Under Cnut and his successors, under the Normans who conquered England in 1066, the north would be ruled by outsiders, by men who owed their positions to distant kings and who saw Northumbria as a troublesome frontier rather than a homeland. Uhtred, by contrast, was a northern lord ruling northern lands, invested in the region's prosperity because it was his prosperity, concerned about local interests because they were his interests. This distinction mattered to later generations who looked back nostalgically to a time when the North had its own leaders and its own voice in national affairs. The blood feud that Uhtred's murder initiated became itself a subject of legend, with stories of elaborate revenges and dramatic confrontations that probably embellished what was actually a series of opportunistic killings spread over decades. But the feud's persistence demonstrated the continuing power of traditional ideas about honour and family obligation in a society that was nominally Christian and increasingly organised under royal law. The kings who ruled England after Cnut tried to suppress such feuds tried to establish royal justice as the proper mechanism for resolving disputes, but the old ways died hard, particularly in the north where royal authority was weak and where people still believed that a man who failed to avenge his father was not worthy of respect. The archaeological evidence from this period, fragmentary though it is, provides some material confirmation of the world the chronicles describe. Excavations at York have revealed a prosperous trading city with connections across the North Sea, with workshops producing luxury goods, with evidence of both English and Scandinavian material culture existing side by side. Fortifications from the period show sophisticated defensive engineering, with ditches and earthworks and stone walls designed to withstand siege. Burial goods from elite graves include weapons and jewellery of high quality, demonstrating both the wealth of the northern nobility and their continuing adherence to traditions of furnished burial that the Church theoretically opposed but tolerated in practice. This material evidence cannot tell us about Uhtred specifically, but it illuminates the world in which he lived and confirms that the chronicles, for all their biases and omissions, describe a real society with real wealth and real conflicts. The question of how much continuity existed between the Northumbria of Uhtred's time and the earlier kingdom of the same name is difficult to answer. The Northumbria that had produced Bede and the Lindisfarne Gospels had been destroyed by Viking conquest in the 9th century, its political structures shattered, its monasteries burned or abandoned, its learned culture dispersed. But cultural traditions have remarkable persistence, and some elements of the earlier Northumbrian identity survived the conquest and re-emerged in later centuries. The peculiarities of Northern English dialect, the distinctive traditions of Northern Christianity, the sense of regional identity that set Northerners apart from Southerners, all these can be traced back through Uhtred's time to the earlier kingdom, suggesting that conquest and political transformation did not entirely erase older cultural patterns. The relationship between history and legend in Uhtred's case illustrates a broader problem in early medieval studies, which is that our sources were written by people with agendas, by monks who wanted to emphasize divine providence and Christian virtue, by chroniclers who served particular kings or noble families, by writers who were trying to make sense of chaotic events in terms of familiar narratives. When we read that Uhtred was bold or treacherous, pious or violent, we are reading not neutral description but interpretation, not objective fact, but someone's attempt to fit a complex human being into a comprehensible category. The real Uhtred was undoubtedly more complicated than any of these characterizations, containing contradictions and inconsistencies that the sources either ignored or tried to explain away. Modern attempts to recover the historical Uhtred face the challenge that the sources are thin and biased, that crucial events are mentioned only briefly or not at all, that chronology is often uncertain and sometimes contradictory. We can establish the basic outline of his career, can identify the major events and transitions, but the details that would make him fully human, the personal relationships and private thoughts and small decisions that shaped larger events, these are mostly lost. What remains is a sketch, a figure glimpsed through fog, substantial enough to know that someone important was there but indistinct enough that imagination must fill many gaps. The literary tradition that eventually produced works like The Last Kingdom drew on this historical Uhtred but transformed him almost beyond recognition, moving his birth forward in time, giving him adventures and relationships that have no historical basis, making him a protagonist in a narrative that requires a certain kind of hero performing certain kinds of actions. This literary Uhtred serves different purposes than the historical one, offering readers adventure and drama and a protagonist with whom they can identify, and these purposes are legitimate even if they require departing from historical fact. But the distance between the historical and literary Uhtred's reminds us that history and fiction are different enterprises with different rules and different obligations, and that confusing them impoverishes both. The final years before Uhtred's death saw the consolidation of Danish power in England and the apparent triumph of Cnut's conquest, but they also saw the persistence of English resistance in various forms, and Uhtred's support for Edmund Ironside represented this continuing struggle. That the struggle ultimately failed, that Cnut became king and established a dynasty that would rule England for a generation, does not diminish the significance of the resistance or the choices of those who participated in it. They were making decisions based on the information available to them, based on their understanding of honour and obligation, based on calculations about risk and reward that turned out to be wrong, but that were not unreasonable at the time. Uhtred's assassination violated the norms that governed aristocratic warfare precisely because those norms were important, because they made political negotiation possible, because they allowed rivals to meet and make agreements without constant fear of treachery. Cnut's decision to murder Uhtred was thus not just a crime against one man, but an assault on the system of tacit rules that allowed medieval politics to function, and it generated exactly the kind of instability, in the form of the subsequent blood feud, that those rules were designed to prevent. That Cnut nevertheless prospered, that his reign was successful and his memory largely positive, demonstrates the uncomfortable truth that political success does not require moral virtue, that effective rule can coexist with terrible crimes, that history judges more by results than by methods, at least in the short run.